So, frankly, I would never ever recommend that any student do what I did, which is go and do their MBA without any work experience. I was 19 when I started, which is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, HBS would have done me a huge favor if they said, look, yeah, we'll let you in, but go and work for 3, 4, 5 years first, right? I think at many, many levels.
5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Hey guys, welcome back to the Way Podcast with your host Sajid Marwar. Today I'm with my professor, Professor Dan Richards, and today we're gonna kind of have a conversation about you and your career and your interests, because I found you to be a very interesting person when I took your course, one-to-one marketing here at Rotman. And yeah, let's just get right into it. How did you begin your career? Let's say your academic career. I remember you mentioned that you did go to the Harvard Business School.
Sure. So I grew up in Montreal, went to McGill, and at that time, it was just taken for granted that if you're going to university, live at home, commute to school. So the notion of going away to broaden your experience was not common at that time. Frankly, I think it's a much better experience for students to actually leave home, go away. I think it's part of the growth process that happens in university. I didn't do that, and I actually, every case is different. I worked while I was at university for 4 years, 6 days a week, from 5 o'clock to 11 o'clock, stocking supermarket shelves.
Wow.
And Monday to Saturday. So that had an impact on my social life, as you might expect. But that was just the circumstances that my family was in. And I have students sometimes say, well, okay, so what made you decide to do your MBA, go to the Harvard Business School? So sometimes people believe that everything in life is about having a plan, and clearly having a general direction is helpful, but there's a huge element of serendipity. So I was in third year, taking a degree in economics and political science, planning to do a law degree, ran into someone who was graduating a year ahead of me. Denis Gagnon was his name, graduate in commerce. I said, Denis, so what are you doing after you graduate? And he says, well, yeah, I'm actually going to do my MBA at the Harvard Business School. So I said, okay, so 2 questions. First, what's an MBA? And second, what's Harvard Business School? I've heard of Harvard, obviously. What's Harvard Business School? So that was the first time that the notion of pursuing a career in business crossed my mind. And that seed ended up leading me to say, okay, well, maybe I'll write my GMAT, file an It's the only business school I applied to. I applied to 1 business school, applied to 3 law schools, got in them all. And so I said, okay, well, you know what? MBA is only 2 years, law school's 3 years, so why don't I do my MBA? And if I don't like it, I can always then do a law degree. So that I'd like to say that I had a much more considered route, but that's sometimes just kind of things happen by chance.
Yeah. And what was your experience like? I remember you mentioned that you went at a younger age.
Yeah. So, frankly, I would never ever recommend that any student do what I did, which is go and do their MBA without any work experience. I was 19 when I started, which is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, HBS would have done me a huge favor if they said, look, yeah, we'll let you in, but go and work for 3, 4, 5 years first, right? I think at many, many levels, I would have been better off. They would have been better off. My classmates would have been better off. But they didn't do that. I said, okay. So my experience, it was a good experience. It was an eye-opening experience. And ton of learning, for sure. But if I had to do it over, we all kind of look back sometimes. That would have been one big change that would have made. It would have worked first.
Yeah, that must have been quite an interesting experience going in as, I mean, a 19-year-old. I'm only 20 right now, but
Right.
like, I can remember a year ago, I know
Right.
so much more
Right.
just in a single year. And then you said like the average age was like,
About 28 or so? Yeah.
yeah. So, 10 plus years more life experience, almost, right?
So I want to come back and pick up on a point that you just made now, which is, you know much more today than you did a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that's true. I'm sure that's true. But one of the things that I've observed is that the path to the amount you learn and how quickly you learn depends on a few things. One of them depends on, are you in environments where you get exposed to new thinking, new opportunities, new
Mm-hmm.
people, things that'll challenge you. That's why one of the things I spend a lot of time talking to students around their career decisions and helping them think through what their options are. And one of the things I talk about is your first job or your first couple of jobs. Really, the most important determinant, in my view, should be how much am I going to learn? And money is less important because, frankly, if you learn a ton in your first couple of jobs, whatever amount of money you might have made elsewhere, a little bit more, you're going to make multiples of because you've accelerated that learning. So the first is the opportunity, but the second is the mindset. And so being a critical thinker, really stepping back and not just letting things wash over you where something happens and okay, that was interesting. No, you've got to step back and think, okay, what does that mean? How did that happen? What's that all about?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I do is, among other things, publish a series of columns in the Globe and Mail on a regular basis, often related to career topics. And I had an article that I published this spring that I got quite a bit of response to, talking about one of the most undervalued traits that drive success in careers, and that's curiosity. So that's, again, a manifestation of that critical thinking. So, yes, you're exposed to new ideas, but then it's the reflection, it's taking time to think, and taking an analytical perspective that I think is the other thing that really accelerates your learning.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think that's definitely maybe contributing to why I believe that I've learned a lot in this last year. I think partly due to this podcast, because personally I wasn't very, I would say, outgoing a few years ago. I had to kind of force myself to I didn't mind making friends, like I didn't have problems with that, but really going out of my way to talk to people, right? When you have something like this, you can't just rely on your own network. You have to expand, and expanding is good because more perspective, more interesting conversations. But it was difficult at first. The reason why I started this was because I started university in COVID, at the height of COVID, like 2021 or 2020 actually. And at that time, I was at home and I had so little access to that, that first year experience of meeting a bunch of new people in person, orientation. There was none of that, right? And the only times we had the ability to talk to people was in like a group project, and most of the time we're just talking about the project.
And you're on Zoom.
Yes, which makes it much harder.
Right.
And the way I actually made friends and good conversation was, after we're done talking about the project, I asked some, basic starting question like, oh, what do you think about the class? What do you think about the professor? General questions that people talk about. And then eventually it would progress, and it's 2 a.m. We're talking about, what do we want our careers to be like? What do we want to, accomplish? And I always felt so fulfilled after those conversations, and especially at a time when we had so little of that kind of new interaction with people. And that's kind of what inspired me to start this, because I enjoyed podcasts for that reason. You know, you're like a fly on the wall in a conversation, and I personally like to listen more in a conversation, especially when there's people with so much more experience in something. And I thought, you know, at least one person will find this valuable. You know, it's an excuse for me to talk to interesting people, and yeah, it was. I'm glad I started it, and I think I've learned so much from that. And speaking of your curiosity in your career, I believe you have been doing keynote speaking for quite a long time. Like, how did you get into that field, I guess?
Again, was not part of a grand plan. It kind of evolved from some other work I was doing. But I want to step back for a moment, if you don't mind, on a point that you made that I think is really important. And it relates to having the discipline and the courage to stretch yourself in terms of your comfort zone. So we all have a certain way of just running our lives that we're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And for most people, that's where they stay. Maybe they stretch a little bit, but they don't tend to move, you know, a lot. And the older people get, the less likely they are to get outside of that comfort zone. And that's, you know, understandable at one level. But there's also a very big cost to that at another. And so you may recall that one of the things that in the course that you took that which related to communications, listening, spontaneity, that one of the things that I proposed as an optional activity is that students who are interested could attend a 1 hour improv workshop, not a performance where you're going to be on the stage in front of other people, but a workshop led by a trained comedian who specializes in improv, 8 people maximum, and to be taken through some of the improv exercises. In an hour, you're not going to become an expert, but kind of as an eye-opening experience. And what I've been struck by, and by the way, Rotman Commerce had said we're prepared to fund that, so there was, it wasn't that expensive to start with, but there was no cost to the students. Mm-hmm. We got a relatively small number of students who put their hand up for that. And despite all of my assurances that no one's going to be embarrassed, no, you're not going to be on stage, but for most people, oh no, that's way too risky. Mm-hmm. So, and that's a personal decision, but those students paid a price for that. The price they paid was the opportunity that they missed to experience something different, to stretch their comfort zones. And so I think that's, again, a critical mindset to really achieve our maximum potential is, it's fine if you evaluate an opportunity and you say, not for me. Great, no problem, that's a personal decision. But I think often people don't do that. They just basically don't even get to the point of evaluating it and making the trade-offs. They just say, oh, no, not comfortable, and they stop there. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really important point that relates to your podcast experience. And kudos to you for taking it on. I'm sure it was initially a little bit scary.
Yeah, it was.
Your first guest, I'm sure you were apprehensive about reaching out to. Who was your first guest?
Well, first guest, I played it safe and had one of my good friends on. Okay. But the first guest that I contacted was actually one of my biggest mentors, right. And I was so stressed out to ask him. He's my martial arts instructor. Right. He instructed me from the age of 11 to 17, and I still, we still talk, and it was so nerve-wracking, especially when it's somebody who, saw me grow from a child to a teenager, and now I'm a young adult. Like, it was very nerve-wracking, and then obviously he was very willing to come on the podcast, and one of my favorite episodes personally, we went really deep into, the martial arts philosophy, and how he began his career in martial arts and teaching, and yeah, but if I never made that scary decision to ask him to be on, then I probably wouldn't have had any other guests other than people I already knew in my personal circle. And I followed some of the teachings like we had in the class, and I've been able to apply those within contacting guests and following up in a way that doesn't make me seem like I'm trying to spam them or something. Just trying to come off as genuine as possible, because that's what the show is, right? Like it's a conversation between two people, nothing more than that. But yes, that's that getting out of your comfort zone is really important. And speaking of that, your transition to keynote speaking.
Sure.
What was that like?
So we have to set some context. When I graduated from business school, I came back to Toronto, and the main reason I came to Toronto was because my first job actually was in corporate finance and capital markets, and Wood Gundy in Toronto was the market leader in Canada, and it paid more than any of the U.S. firms. It paid more than Goldman, paid more than Salomon, paid than Morgan Stanley. Nobody could have foreseen the separation of compensation that happened subsequently, but at the time, so okay. Plus, Canada was home, so I settled in Toronto and spent roughly, call it the first 15 years, really working in a variety of roles for Canadian subsidiaries of multinationals, and primarily sales and marketing roles. I didn't spend a lot of time in corporate finance, decided it was just not for me, and so I made a transition and worked for Pepsi-Cola, worked for Wrigley, worked for an advertising agency called Young & Rubicam that was the biggest in the world at the point, and did well. I got promoted, I won awards, got bonuses, but ultimately really decided that the politics of life in a large corporate setting was not for me. I've been fairly fortunate in the businesses that I built and run and sold, and I think some of my success is attributable to a quality that I think is maybe one of my biggest strengths, but also one of my biggest weaknesses, which is patience is the strength side, impatience is the weakness side. And so, or sure, I should flip that. Yeah. Impatience is the strength is the strength side, right? But that's also a weakness, depending on the context.
Yes.
So that impatience, that bias for action, that frustration about how long things took, I was chafing, and so in about 1989, I'd been a partner in a mid-sized marketing and advertising consultancy, decided to go on my own, and I say to students sometimes in life, being lucky is much better than being smart. So I chose to focus on the mutual fund, asset management industry at a time when it was set to explode like that, and nobody could have seen that coming. And so that's where I was lucky. But what I did that followed that I believe was pivotal in my success, was, I think, something that I do take credit for, and that was focusing on building visibility and credibility as someone who has expert credentials in that narrow space. And this was at a time where there were no experts. There was no, when it comes to marketing and sales, which is where I focused. Yeah. And I had some packaged goods discipline, and I'd had a little bit of experience in the financial services arena. And so I approached the editor of at the time, the only publication for the Canadian financial industry. This was 1989, and said, I'd be interested in submitting a column. And she said, okay, sure. So I submitted it, and ran it, and I began doing monthly columns. And what that then led to is I had a little bit of credibility. And then I approached the columnists from the Globe and Mail and the National Post and some of the other national publications about, would you be interested in getting and talking about my perspective, what's going on? And I said, sure, because nobody else was talking to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started getting quoted. So again, now my visibility and credibility got amplified. And then in about, I want to say 1992, so about 3 years later, I got a call out of the blue from somebody who was the Ontario sales manager for Scotia McLeod, which was a brokerage arm of Bank of Nova Scotia, and said, we're doing a workshop for our financial advisors in Kingston on September 15th. Wonder whether you'd be interested in coming out and doing a morning session. So I said, okay, well, what would you like to talk about? Anything. You talk about anything you want to talk about. And I said, okay, I think I'd do that. And he said, now, what would your price be? What would your cost be? Thinking, gosh, what would my cost be? I've never done this before. What would my cost be? One morning, 3 hours. So I think I delivered one of the least effective responses to that question on record, because I think I said something like $2,500, raising my voice at the end because I was prepared to have him slam the phone and say, what, are you nuts? And he said, okay, $2,500. Tell you what, I think we can sign you up for 3 at that price. And that was when the light started dawning. Okay, so maybe, $2,500
is a low ball.
Is a low ball number. And so I quickly discovered that there actually was a fair size market for people to speak to conferences of financial advisors. And in some cases they were, all financial advisors, which is what happened in this case. In some cases, they were reward trips, so their very best financial advisors would be flown to some exotic destination, and they needed a speaker or speakers to give it an educational component, because if there wasn't an educational component, then it wasn't a business expense. And the financial advisors all ended up having to pay tax on the value of the trip, which none of them were happy about. So, and so I quickly discovered, first of all, that $2,500 was a very, very modest price for that. I also discovered that I liked doing it. I discovered I was good at it. And so that combination of things ended up leading. That was never a huge part of my business because it's not scalable.
Yeah.
But I did a fair amount of those, and I was at the end. I think I was charging for a keynote address $15,000, which is insane. Right? You think about it by any objective measurement, and this would sometimes be like for 45 minutes or an hour.
Yeah.
$15,000 is nuts. It completely and totally Looney Tunes. But that's what the market commanded for somebody who had a track record, brought credibility. And you think about the decision makers. If it's a large firm, they're extremely risk averse.
Yeah.
And so they so nevertheless, so that's a long convoluted answer to a simple question. So that's kind of how I backed into it, largely by accident.
I see. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Like that whole keynote speaking and the need for an expert when there was none. And were you during what would be like the content? I know it would vary from place to place, but what would the content be?
So one of the things that made me successful was that my advice would be very practical. So lots of financial advisors. These are entrepreneurs. These are independent business people, and they're looking to either attract more clients or do a better job of serving existing clients, looking for ways to get referrals, maximize revenue. And so I would offer some very, very tangible, specific advice. And so one of the things I remember I talked about is I'd start a session. Okay, hands up everybody who would like your clients to be satisfied. Right? And I said, oh, yeah, everyone's hand goes up. And I said, right, okay. So imagine that you went to dinner last night, here in Phoenix or wherever we were, and this morning, somebody here at the conference says, I'm thinking about booking a reservation for dinner tonight. So that restaurant last night, tell me about it. How happy were you? Suppose you said, yeah, I was satisfied. How compelling a recommendation is that? And the answer, of course, is not very compelling at all.
Mm-hmm.
What's the response you need? The response is not I was satisfied. The response is it was fantastic. It was fabulous. It was terrific. It was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Not I was satisfied, but I was blown away. I was ecstatic. And so what I would start off doing is challenging the conventional thinking among my audience for financial advisors to get them to rethink the standard they needed to aspire to in terms of the level of client enthusiasm. And then I'd say, okay, now how do we do that? And so then I would get into some specific, tangible examples. And sometimes they were little things, not big things, that could lead to happier clients.
It's so interesting how even at the highest level, especially when you have these financial analysts or advisors that are awarded all these, and they all come in one place, the best in the world, and they receive this advice that on the outside, if somebody weren't maybe in a field that is like this, that is very client driven, like a service-based industry, they might not understand the significance of like this small little things in interaction between you and just another human being, but especially with in the context of a client and you're providing a service, how, like I remember during class you mentioned like sending a thank you note or calling them on their birthday and saying, I just want to wish you a happy birthday. These little things that we think don't really affect us, but I mean, if I was to receive a phone call, I'm sure I would be like, oh, thank you, I appreciate that, or a card or something, right?
So what's interesting about that specific example, I'm impressed that you remember that, because we covered that that's almost a year ago that we covered that example. But you may remember the context was that this was a room full of top performing financial advisors, and their client, their average client might call it $5 million in investments with them. So a $5 million client, if it will generate, in Canada, it would be lower in the U.S. because fees are higher in Canada, but we're in Canada, so let's assume we're here. So a $5 million client would generate, revenue on average for the firm of 1% per year. So $5 million, $50,000 in revenue, and typically a financial advisor would get half of that, and the rest goes to the firm for overhead and all of the other associated support requirements. So you're talking about a client that's generating $25,000 a year, not just this year, but as long as they're with you on an ongoing basis. And so some advisors will say, okay, so for a client like that, I'm going to look for an opportunity to really solidify my relationship. A lot of golfers among financial advisors, especially those that are in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and a lot of their clients are golfers too. And so, I've had, in the context you may recall, I talked about, an advisor who would take their client for a golf game in an afternoon to an outstanding golf course, taking dinner, might drop, $500, $600, $700, and that would be regarded as a good investment. And then that same advisor heard about this idea that on your client's birthday, you should pick up the phone, call them, just want to be among the first to happy birthday, and so tried it, and was astounded by the fact they got a better response to that phone call than they did to the $500 or $600 or $700 golf game. So you may recall we spent some time talking about why that is, and a lot of it has to do with expectations. So that golf game, yes, it may be appreciated, but not a surprise. It kind of comes with the territory. It's your due as a client. You know that you're not a fool. You know your advisor's, making a meaningful amount of money off of your account, and you're happy with that.
Yeah.
as opposed to something that's completely out of context, is not expected, that is personal, and where it doesn't feel like there's anything in it for the financial advisor.
Yeah, yeah. And I found it so, it's kind of funny just thinking about how such a basic human thing of showing that you're appreciated by somebody else can go so far, even at the highest stakes of whatever it be, money or maybe competition or something like that. And I remember you mentioned earlier about the politics of being within a large corporation and how that wasn't really for you. I want to just pivot to your work with charity.
Sure.
How did you get started in that?
So, my first involvement with a charity was after I came to Toronto, and I had some time, and so I volunteered as a Big Brother. And the Big Brothers program, essentially you're matched with typically, boy anywhere from, call it 8 to 12. You meet with them, kind of for one Saturday morning or afternoon a week. And it's to provide kind of mentorship guidance. And so I began doing that. And then I got involved in the board of directors of Big Brothers. And so that was my first involvement. And then, life happened. Got married, had kids, launched my own business. So that all dropped off the scene in terms of priority, right? Like for a long time in my career, called 20 years, it was. I mean, I tried to support as much as I could what I thought were good charities financially, but I didn't really do much beyond that. And then what happened in 2000, one of my clients, who happened to be at Royal Bank at the time, approached me as to whether I'd serve on a committee of the United Way of Greater Toronto's fundraising committee. So I said, top client, good cause, sure, of course. And then the following year, actually it was 1999, because the following year was 2000, I got asked would I like to serve on the campaign cabinet of the United Way. So the United Way of Toronto is the largest annual recurring charity in North America. Raises approaching $150 million to support lots of the good causes that do the critical work that keep our city kind of a great place to live. Clearly there are issues, we can do better, but it's on balance a pretty good place to live compared to most alternatives. And so I was one of about 25 typically senior business people under the leadership. Each year there was a campaign chair who typically would be a very senior bank CEOs often. We'd meet once a month, and then we would kind of go out there and we would all have a portfolio that we would lead with support from United Way staff. So I actually did that for 5 years. Normally you're on campaign cabinet 1 year or 2 years. I actually ended up, doing it for 5. And I think the reason I did it for 5 is I got asked to do it for 5. But going back to that patience, impatience, my involvement and my experience with many businesses, but especially charities, is when you're on the board of small and mid-sized charities, you can often divide board members into 2 categories: doers and talkers. And and so I'm a doer, right? And that's just my nature. You see a problem, all right, let's crack it. And not everybody has that orientation.
Yeah.
And so, I was actually ended up kind of getting viewed as kind of the Mr. Fix-It. Whatever portfolio I had a problem with, I would ask to take on. So I did it for 5 years. And at the end of that, so fast forward, it's now 2005, I had sold the second startup that I was very fortunate. I sold my first startup that was built around research to Embryonics Research. Then I built a second startup which was a conference business for advisors to Rogers Communication. Then it got recruited by some former clients to be CEO of a public company. helped turn it around, led the sale, and it became ultimately part of Scotia. By now, it's now 2005. And so what now? And I'd been doing some teaching at Rotman at that time for, about 12 or 13 years as a sessional, but not huge commitment. And so that's where I really started getting much more involved in charities, because now I had the bandwidth. And I also had connections that I hadn't had 20 years ago. And my orientation, this is everyone's very personal choice, is I've had the opportunity to kind of go on the boards of the glamour charities, the big names, and I've chosen not to do that. And it's not because they're not doing great work. They are doing great work. But, they have no shortage of board members, right? And for me, my focus is, where can I make a unique difference where if it's not me, it's not going to be somebody else? And so the first charity I got really involved with heavily was I did a trek up Kilimanjaro in 2004 and stumbled across a children's home in Tanzania that helped get street youth, kids as young as 6 and 7 off the streets. And so with a good friend of mine who happened to do a trek up Kilimanjaro following year, visited it also, we started a series of fundraising dinners. We raised, we're still involved. This would have been, we started in 2008. So here we are 15 years later. We've raised well over $2 million, probably $3 million now. Tapping into our network and our connections. But then that's led to getting involved in a second African charity that works in Uganda that's doing remarkable things. Has taken this year, by January, it'll have taken 1 million residents of remote villages in Uganda out of poverty.
That's amazing.
Astonishing work by a fabulous young founder based here in Toronto. I'm chair of a refugee committee that sponsors refugees to come to Canada. I volunteer and help raise money for a drop-in center at the Bloor and Avenue Road that for 25 years has been helping people that are underhoused in shelters on the street, provides food, provides a place for them to stay in the mornings. And so my focus has been very much on kind of smaller, mid-sized charities, where I feel I can make a positive impact. And almost always I've ended up getting involved in fundraising because that's a scarce resource. If you're a small, mid-sized charity, where do you need help most? Often it's fundraising.
Makes sense, yeah. That's something that I feel that maybe people who are on the outside that aren't involved, but they want to support maybe financially, and they look at these large charities and think like how am I really going to make a difference with like X amount of money? Oh, it's going to go through all this red tape, and that's why I think it's so valuable. These smaller, mid-sized, like for example, the charity I work for, Let's Stop AIDS, was started by our founder, Shaman Muhammad Jr. He started at 15 years old here in Toronto. And the reason why was because he had such a lack of education. And even back then, even in like 2005, he was trying to go to school boards, and he said, I don't know what HIV is. We have no education on anything related to sexual health or anything like that. And, all these issues are persisting. And his first project that he did was actually in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's still going on today. It's called Spread Trees, Not AIDS. And it's a combination of planting trees and reforesting many deforested areas, and also spreading information about HIV treatment, and it's made a big difference. And we're here 19 years later. I've joined now, and it's there's so many programs, and there's just something different about that. Even though it's been around for a long time, it's still relatively small. We have 15 members that are staff, and then there's many volunteers. And the way it is in the office, like, it's just I guess that's like sure, like for example, like I have friends that are working at like banks and like private equity, and it's like sure they're probably going to they would make more money from that role or whatever, but I get to work in my field of marketing, right, an entry level position, and I also get to see this side, which is something that I've always wanted to be involved on that level. And I've volunteered before, like with my family and stuff, but never been as involved as this. And I really felt that when I was in Saskatchewan, because they have the highest rate of HIV in the entire country, and we are in Regina, and we went to Regina and Saskatoon, and we're running these things called peer-to-peer workshops, which are essentially youth-run workshops where they explain to people their age, what is HIV, how do you prevent it, how do you have a stable relationship, like a lot of things surrounding it, not just the education about it. And when we were there, you can see the impact of, because they stopped the fund, I believe they lost funding, the funding ran out in 2015 from the government, and the rate of HIV skyrocketed there. I think it's gone up 50% in the last 2 years, which is crazy. And when we're there, you can really see it. It's a huge problem. Like we were in Regina, the capital of the province, and there's a tent city outside of City Hall,
Right.
which is it's something to see, right?
Yeah. Look, I think that so to your credit, that you took this on, and you did it not for the money, obviously,
No.
partly for the experience.
Yes, yeah.
Partly to fulfill your passion. But in truth, if you decide when you graduate that you want to pursue a corporate role, or you want to work for an advertising agency, you want to work for marketing and P&G, it doesn't matter whatever. This experience, I think, will serve you very well, both in terms of the ability to do the job, but the ability to get the job, in terms of how you differentiate yourself in the conversations that you have with recruiters in a way that's really memorable. So kudos to you for taking that on. I want to come back and pick up on a point, though, I think earlier about kind of many young folks I talk to want to get involved in charities. And that's great. That's something that wasn't there to nearly this level when I graduated from university a long time ago. And so I'm just so inspired and impressed by that. But then I'll have to say, but how? What can I do? How can I make a difference? And in truth, it's going to be hard. Maybe not impossible, but it's going to be hard to make a difference if you say, I want to get involved with the United Way, or Sick Kids Hospital, or Princess Margaret, or the big charities that are well staffed, have infrastructure. But then there are a slew of small, mid-sized charities doing fabulous work that may not even have the 15 staff that Let's Stop AIDS does. Like I think about Common Table, which is the drop-in at Bloor Avenue Road that serves 80 to 120 people a day and does remarkable work. Well, their staff complement, I think, is 3. And no, so what's interesting is one of our conversations is, how do we build our presence in terms of social media? Well, who's got the expertise? Nobody's got the expertise on staff, and they're scrambling looking for volunteers. It's hard. So if any student from U of T went there and said, I'd like to volunteer for 3 hours a week to help you on social media, they would be greeted with open arms. And that's just one of many, many small, mid-sized organizations that are doing fabulous work, where there's a huge opportunity for any student who's got social media skills, and I think almost all of your generation have those, to make a positive difference. but also to learn in a different way, to expand the network,
Yeah.
and, by the way, position yourself when it comes to competing for a full-time role, if that's what you want to do in a corporate setting, to, again, help separate yourself from everybody else.
And I think one thing about my role right now that I think I wouldn't get anywhere else in a similar, like for example, at a for-profit firm as an entry-level position, I wouldn't get as much access or working not on like the tactical level, but on the strategic level. Like I'm the one working with our director of communications who manages all the different communications, making the strategy with her. And, as a marketing intern in a large firm, like what is the likelihood of them going to one of their interns and saying, come to the meeting about the marketing strategy for the firm?
Well, we know what the
Right.
likelihood is going to be. It's like zero, right?
Yes,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
And sure, maybe it's, in some ways it's harder because you have more responsibility. Like I'm the one posting, and I talk directly with my manager and with Shaman as well. But I think that, it's like one of those things like you mentioned, getting out of your comfort zone, right? Not to say that it's not hard to be a marketing intern at a large for-profit firm. It's just different. The responsibility that I have, I'm actually quite grateful for, even though I might get paid the same as somebody who has less responsibility at another firm, because of, like you said, the experience that I gained from it. Because as somebody who, I have the podcast, and I do all the social media for it, and most of the time I'm just using whatever knowledge I have from my commerce background, but nothing beats actually being in there, right?
But I'm also going to suggest to you that you're actually being paid more this summer than your classmates that are working for the banks or private equity firms. Because there's two kinds of compensation. There is the financial income, clearly, but there's a second kind of compensation. There's financial income, and then there's psychic income. And the psychic income is how we feel about what we're doing. And, never underestimate the impact of that. I think about, I mentioned the founder of Raising the Village, which is his charity that works in Uganda. So his name's Sean Holden Chung, graduated from McMaster in Commerce in 2005, took a job with Accenture, but before Accenture that summer volunteered microcredit in Uganda and worked in Kampala, the capital, and got to know some of the locals, many of whom were from remote areas outside of Kampala, who were incredibly frustrated because Uganda is one of the poorest countries in the world, and all of the big NGOs work in Kampala because it's easy to get to. And the remote areas, which are at the bottom of the pyramid, so there's what's described as the poverty pyramid, and at the bottom is the absolute poorest of the poor, and many of them were those villages. So Sean was invited to go and visited, spent the next 7 years while he was at Accenture, using his own time, his own money, and money raised from friends and family, running experiments in remote villages in Uganda, exploring ways to help these villagers get out of poverty. And most of them failed initially, but he began by repeating experiments, by finding themes, finding models, finding approaches. In 2012, 7 years later, and Sean was doing very well. He's a super bright guy, super capable, great people skills, a terrific speaker, and he was on track to partnership at Accenture and other things, but he chose to leave because he wanted to devote his energy and his passion to making that difference. Now, he took a master's at Kennedy School. When I joined the board in 2014, the revenue was $250,000, not sustainable. Today, the revenue is $8 million and climbing and on its way to something that could be much bigger than that. Because they've developed a model that's grassroots based, that for $20 per person can permanently take a village of 1,000 people, so $20,000 out of poverty forever, which is remarkable. And so, but it comes back to one individual who had the dream, had the passion, had the commitment, and was prepared to forego financial income because he was excited enough by the opportunity and had that offsetting kind of psychic income from what he was doing.
No, that is definitely remarkable, and it's something that maybe I've struggled with at this age, as I, transition out of university, going into my last year next year, and then hopefully working after that. That perspective of the actual financial income and the psychic income, as you mentioned, there's kind of the battle, right? Always in your mind,
right.
And especially, like for example, my parents. They're first generation, or first generation. Does first generation mean you're born here? The first generation born in a new country?
Yeah. So the first generation, normally, yes.
Okay, so they're both first. Basically, my dad came here when he was 2 years old from India, and my mom was born here. Their parents came here, worked very, very hard in a time when that wasn't friendly, and that influenced them to work hard. And I'm glad, I got lucky with my parents because they turned out pretty all right, and they were pretty nice to me. But they worked very hard, and maybe it's a generational thing, but the thought of, because they knew that if you go to this route and you make all this money, that's when you can make a difference. And not that money is happiness, but money reduces your worry, right? Which can in turn increase your happiness. What I struggle with is, how do I balance that as I go into my career? How can I try? I mean, obviously the goal is to have both.
Right.
But oftentimes in the beginning, it's, especially in your early 20s, into your 30s, it's about grinding,
right.
Making as much money as you can. And then, I've made enough money, I can do this here, pursue this passion or whatever. Did you have that same?
So, let me say, for me, it's an absolutely individual decision. There's no right or wrong answer on that. But again, you have to look at the context. When I started working, there were no examples or role models of somebody who had built a significant business from a charity from scratch at a very young age. That it just wasn't on the radar screen as an option to even think about. Today, the circumstances have changed, and your comment about the trade-offs and where do you focus and how do you focus, and then you've got your personal life as well. So you've got kind of your business, your career, you've got your personal life, kids perhaps at some point, and then you've got kind of giving back and the balance between those three. And in truth, I think I look at myself like I went through a long period where all I focused on was my business and helping raise my kids. Right? That's it. Nothing else. And I didn't give any thought, particularly, to giving back. Now, maybe that was the wrong decision, but it was the right decision for me at that time. Now, I think I've made up for it since then.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the reason I made up for it since then is that my network that I built has given me the capacity that other people might not have. And so, for example, when I got involved at Common Table, they run on a fairly shoestring budget, and their dishwasher, they've got a commercial dishwasher because they're producing, large quantities of meals and serving, soup and so on, and so they need a commercial dishwasher. 20 years old, leaking, breaking down, causing flooding, need to be replaced. $20,000. Didn't have $20,000. And so they literally had duct tape, right, to help seal the leaks.
Yeah. And
so I was able to reach out to a friend of mine who I've known for a very long time, who works for one of the banks, who's on the board of one of their charities, and kind of was able to put together a proposal, and was able to get $10,000. They'd never gotten $10,000 from a bank before, and then we were able to, from that to the others, we were able to solve the problem. Now, I was able to do that because I built a relationship. I had a network, and I was very lucky. That's something that not everybody has. I recognize that. But, I think it would be hard for somebody who, is 25 or 30 to build networks at that level. So that's my approach, but it's not everybody's approach. I do think what I did is which is, kind of be linearly focused and just 100% focused. I wouldn't advise that today. I do think that having more of a balance in terms of, yes, business, yes, family and friends, but also giving back, doesn't have to be a third, but having some element of giving back, I think is important. It's important just from an ethical standing point, but it also, frankly, is one of the ways you build relationships and expand your network. It's not the main reason for doing it, but it's ancillary benefit that comes along with it. But again, that's my view. That's not everybody's view, and so you just have to recognize that's a personal decision that everyone has to make for themselves.
Yeah, and then that kind of, I think that, because my parents always raised me with that idea, it is really ingrained in our culture and also within our religion. And there's this concept of seva. Seva means to serve. So when you go to a Sikh temple, you should, after you go and you listen and you sit down, you listen to the prayer, and you go to eat. My parents always taught me you should do some sort of seva, like service to the people that are there. So, because it doesn't matter who you are, you sit on the ground. Everyone eats out of the same kind of plates. They're nothing fancy. It's a metal tray, and it's served by people there. And the concept of that seva was ingrained for me when I was young. Right. So I would take the water and ask anyone who wants water. Right. And that I've always wanted to, because as I been going through school, I've had less time. I don't go to the Gurdwara as often, and not that it's even in a religious sense. It's more of maybe a personal duty that I find that I want to do this, and I feel like everyone wants to give back, right? Any decent person wants to help other people, but I just...
You hope so?
Oh, yeah.
But in truth, yeah, everybody does. At some level, I suppose. There are sociopaths who don't, but let's set them aside.
Yeah.
But then the question is, how much of a trade-off are you prepared to make to do that, right? This may not be a perfect parallel, but you're walking down the street and you see somebody bedraggled and in need of help, and they've got their hand out, and okay, so you've got a tune in your pocket, all right? So you give it to them, and you think you're making a difference. You feel a little bit better, or you feel less guilt. But then let's suppose you saw someone across that street, that same person. Would you walk across the street to give them that $2? Well, maybe, but maybe people wouldn't, because that's extra amount of effort that's entailed. So again, I do believe it's a very personal decision. We all have to be ruled by our own values in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what's right for us. Um, but we're influenced by norms as well. But we're influenced by you know, the culture of philanthropy in Canada um, is, I think, reasonably strong. It's not as strong as the U.S. It's interesting. There's this view among many Canadians, oh, Americans are kind of much more self-absorbed
Mm-hmm.
and self-centered, and they don't care about other people as much. But in fact, the data is crystal clear that the level of charitable giving in the U.S. is much higher. Some of that is because of giving to churches, but even setting that aside, the level of charitable giving, the norms are different in the U.S. and in Canada. Some of that influenced by mega donors that you don't see in Canada to the same extent. But people are influenced for sure by the norms around them. But I want to come back and pick up on, I think, on a point that you made, which is, and I run into this in a bit of a different context, which is someone who says, okay, so I'm 21 and I'm going to start a charity, similar to the founder of Let's Stop AIDS, 15
Mm-hmm.
years old, and I'm going to, make a dramatic difference in changing the world. And that's great, right? And I applaud that. And there is some relationship to the conversations I have with some MBA students, sometimes commerce students, who are graduating and come to me for advice about whether they've got an idea for a startup, whether they should launch a startup right out of school, or whether they should work first. And my answer is it depends. Same thing as someone says, I'm thinking about this charity. Should I start that up? Well, it depends. So if you've done your research and you're really passionate, and if you've got a team of at least 2 people, ideally 3 or 4, but at least 2, because we know that any startup, the chances of success are remote. One study on startups is that 10% of startups who make it past the finish line in terms of actually starting, forget about people thinking about it, but actually starting, 10% succeed, 90% fail. And of the 10%, many of them are limping along, really not hitting the level of success that they can pay the bills, but that's not what the founders had in mind. So, my view is that recognizing that startups are inherently incredibly hard, we need to do everything we can to tilt the odds in our favor. So, having multiple founders is one way. But another way is working for some period of time before you do the startup. And there is a compelling body of evidence that the most successful startups, there's something called unicorns, which are ones that are valued at $1 billion. The average age of founders is in the 40s. So I think about probably the most successful classmate that I had, a guy named Tom Stamberg, finished top of the class at Harvard Business School. Super, super, super smart guy. I remember talking to Tom. I said, Tom, what are you going to do after you graduate? A very common question among students as they finish. He says, yeah. He says, I've taken a job with a supermarket chain in Chicago called Jewel Foods. And I said, really? Jewel Foods? He says, yeah, everyone says that. Because, yeah, I could go to work for McKinsey, I could work for Goldman, but yeah, I'm a smart guy, but everyone, they're smart. I got no competitive advantage. Jewel Foods, I think I'll stand out. And Jewel Foods was actually also quite acquisitive, so it was growing rapidly through mergers, which also created opportunities. So about 6 months later, I was in Chicago on business and arranged to meet Tom for dinner, and they said, well, meet me at the store, so I went to the store, and Tom was behind the counter as an apprentice butcher. Didn't do that for long, but got promoted again. A few years later, he's EVP strategy. Then he has a falling out with the CEO and gets fired. And very capable guy, so gets another job quickly. Didn't start as a butcher. He kind of started at a senior level, but did well for a period of time. And again, about 6 years later, gets fired again. Another conflict. So twice in 12 years. So Tom, at this point, I remember talking to him at a reunion that we had. I said, well, okay, screw it. All right, this is clearly not for me. And so he started a little company. Took him about a year, maybe two, to kind of do his due diligence and the research and start it up. Started a company that I think most of your listeners and viewers would have heard of, called Staples. So spectacularly successful.
Mm-hmm.
And now Tom's passed away, unfortunately. He ran into a bout with cancer, which is, just kind of luck of the draw. But I remember talking to Tom, he says, look, if I may not have had to spend 12 years, but if I hadn't spent some meaningful amount of time, wouldn't have seen the opportunity. If I'd seen it, couldn't have executed it. And even if I could have executed it, couldn't have assembled the team, the money, just couldn't have made it happen. So, and then Tom went on to say, and this was at a time when the NBA was drafting players in high school, which is no longer possible. There was talk about maybe they'll go back to that. And he says, everyone talks about LeBron James. What they don't talk about is the other 3 high school players that were drafted in the first round the same year as LeBron that no one's ever heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're LeBron or someone at his level, there are only a very few. Kobe Bryant would be another. You've got such incredible talent that you're going to succeed no matter what. But for every one LeBron James, there are a dozen players who, if they'd spent a couple of years in college, might have had great careers, but no one's ever heard of. And I think the same is true of founders, whether it be of charities, whether it be of tech startups. So the impatience, which is a great virtue at one level, can also be something that will stand in your way of your success.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are lots of examples that I can point to of students who took a corporate role, but then while they were working for Procter & Gamble, let's say, were meeting with classmates and co-founders on the side and every second Saturday and took for 2 or 3 years and then did a startup.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When they had, a little bit more experience, credibility, network, a little money in the bank, and their odds of success improved dramatically.
That's it's funny. My dad has the exact same perspective, and because I was talking to him like, what do I want to do after, and I think maybe eventually I want to go into maybe marketing, consulting, advertising, like doing my own thing, and I was thinking like when would I start this and how am I going to go about it, and then he suggested to me, he's a lawyer. And he said, when I started my own firm right at the gate. It's like the first 10 years were so difficult to find clients. Because, sure, he has the ability to make a much higher ceiling of money than somebody working at a big law firm. But also, he's like, maybe if I took that offer or went for that offer to work at X law firm, those extra few years of experience would have given me that, a leg up when I started my own.
Right.
And I think that perspective, I would agree, like just even from what I've been seeing, and I think maybe it's because I feel like it's romanticized, right?
For
the
sure.
Entrepreneurship life and whatever field that is exposed to people and shown in movies, right, is going to be glamorized. But in real life, it's okay to not going 100% for one thing, right? I mean, there's research that backs up that the percentage of people that actually survive, even within any field, let alone starting a new company, which is astronomically difficult, is so low, that in the grand scheme of things, what is 4 or 5 years of experience going to make in your potentially 50-year-long career?
So to your point about we've come out of a period where startups and startup founders absolutely are romanticized. There's no question, but I think that there are a couple of fallacies. One of them is your chances of success. Everybody thinks about, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to a less extent, but sometimes people talk about Michael Dell, Richard Branson. Yes, of course, there are Elon Musk, although someone like Musk, worked, in kind of for a period of time in a small corporate setting, not that many. He didn't, he doesn't have the capacity to work in a big corporate setting. That's one of the things some people just don't have the capacity to work within the structure of a corporate context. And if that's the case, yeah, do your own thing, because you're not going to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to be successful in all likelihood in a larger corporate setting. But fortunately, most people are able to work in a corporate setting, but they may not want to. But so it gets romanticized in terms of your chance of success. But the other thing that gets romanticized is people who've never done it have no idea how incredibly, brutally hard, doing a de novo startup is for the first time. Now, first time if you're successful, the second time's not easy, but it's much easier because you have access to talent, access to money, and each time you're successful, it becomes easier the next time. First of all, you've gotten some experience, but you also have access to resources that you just don't have as, a first-time founder. Whether it be a charity, whether it be a business, whether, I think the same principle holds true.
And maybe it's I'm just, like, from the top of my head, off the top of my head, I look at this from the perspective of, like, my martial arts perspective. A lot of times you see people wanting to learn this fancy technique and like form their own style when they fight, right? And I compare that maybe to starting a company from scratch and doing everything yourself. You don't have the legs underneath you yet. You haven't done the hard work in the sense of grinding. Like, you got to do your push-ups, you got to learn your basic techniques. Like, for example, when I first started, like, my instructor was very strict in the sense of adhering to a technique and not varying from that. But after a certain point, he said, now you have the basics, now you can explore, you have the fundamentals. And I think we can compare that easily to starting a company within a specific, in the tech world or in finance or in marketing, whatever it may be. You gotta get that real world experience, and just because, especially, I like to liken things to that because I have more experience in that. There's a famous saying by Mike Tyson that everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. And what's more a proverbial punch to the face than starting a company and realizing you have to deal with everything and not just what you think you have to.
So I think what you're talking about is exactly right. Another way to frame it is thinking about building the foundation. The foundation's not glamorous, right? But you go out and build a spectacular house, but if your foundation isn't solid, that house isn't going to withstand the first storm that comes along. And so I think thinking about it from that way, I think, could be a useful kind of way to frame it.
And speaking of building a foundation, often when it comes to these fields, like, you see it in classrooms, and oftentimes people get a rude awakening when they go into the working world. What is something that you find, like, that is a disconnect from, let's just say in business, for example, from the classroom when students transition into working? What's something that's...
So let me give you one example. I can give you more than one.
Yeah.
But, so one of the things that I do at Rotman is I oversee the internship, the course associated with internships that are a requirement to graduate. So every full-time MBA student has to do an MBA, has to do an internship. And one of the things that I've added is 4-week interim feedback. So students historically will get, kind of performance evaluation at the end of the summer, fine, maybe good learning for the future, but not helpful in terms of maximizing your performance and learning, and also not helpful if your goal is to get a return offer. So we added a simple 3-question interim evaluation at the end of week 4. And so I see all of those. And one of the most common themes that I'll see is student, super bright, super capable, so delighted to have them, huge asset, great work ethic, like all positive, great. And then area for improvement. And one of the most common things that I read is this student needs to understand that long reports may be fine for university, but aren't what we're looking for here. And so in a corporate context, you may recall one of the themes in the course you took, 101 Marketing, was less is more. Less is more in many, many contexts. So you think about Procter & Gamble, considered to be the most successful consumer marketer of the 20th century. They're noted for having a 1-page memo. So if you, starting in the 30s, wanted to make a recommendation as a product manager, you had to distill everything down to 1 page. And so the discipline of being forced to distill your recommendations down to 1 page, in the case of Procter & Gamble, it doesn't have to be 1 page everywhere, but really condense, make it easy for the reader, have an executive summary, use bullet points rather than text, have white space. This is a skill that I think very few students encounter in university, unless they take a course like the one you took, right? So you've got students who think they're great writers, maybe they are great writers in a university context, but doesn't translate in terms of writing effectively in the business setting in most cases. So that's one of the reasons that I say to students when you're doing an internship or when you're starting a full-time job and you're asked to put together a presentation, write a memo, do a report, say 2 things. First, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. And then second, could I see a sample of a previous report or a previous presentation or a previous email or a memo that I could use as a role model? Because one of the challenges to be successful in any organization, whether it be a business, whether it be government, whether it be a charity, is figuring out what the norms are within the organization and then adapting to those. Doesn't mean doing exactly everything, but being consistent with the norms of those at that organization. Now, you may disagree with the norms of the organization, and when you become CEO, you'll have an opportunity to change that. But in the meantime, when you're starting, you have to roughly accept the norms, and then you can maybe advocate for change if something is really wrong. But you start by saying, okay, so what are the norms of the organization to operate within? So that would be one example. There are others I can think of, but that would be one example of a case where there's a disconnect between what students learn in university and then what actually works when they're out of university.
And just moving on to, I would like to talk about, I know we don't have too much time left, but you've been a professor for quite a while now, and I always wondered how, a lot of commerce professors, the nature of the field is that you have to have real world experience before you can actually teach it to somebody. How did you transition from, having your other careers and ventures into teaching?
Right. So again, not a grand plan. Sometimes things just happen fortuitously. I mentioned I was on the board of Big Brothers in 1980. I was VP Marketing at Wrigley at the time, and one of the other board members happened to teach in the business school at York, taught marketing at the business school at York. So he asked me to do a guest talk. Next day called, said, students loved it. Would I like to teach at York? So I said, sure. So it was evenings. So for 8 years, I would, after work, drive up, teach one course, a couple of hours, leave. And then after 8 years, I got tired with the commute. Plus, I was on the cusp of starting my own startup, and it was not going to be a priority with everything else going on, so I stopped. And then about 4 years after that, out of the blue, I get a call from, this was 1992, from the area coordinator for marketing at the U of T before it became Rotman. One of my students from New York was doing his PhD at the U of T. They were looking for someone to teach marketing strategy. Would I like to teach? So I said, sure. Didn't have to worry about the commute. And that's really, how it started. And so it's 30 plus years now I've been teaching. But most of that 30 years, I've not been hugely engaged, in the sense that I was engaged clearly and committed when I was teaching to the class and to the students. But similar to York, would show up, teach, leave, often in the evenings, and I really only have gotten fully engaged at Rotman. Really, I want to say the last 8 years or so. I got a call, I think it was 2015, as to would I like to take on teaching intra-marketing to the commerce program, because that was a year that they were changing fundamentals of marketing, RSM 250, from second year to first year. And it was a double cohort, because you had all the first year students needed to take in second year, plus all of the new students. They needed to double up the number of instructors. So that was supposed to be 1 year. I ended up doing it like for 4 or 5 years. Yeah. But then from there, it's expanded other courses. This year I'm teaching 12 courses, across 4 programs. I'm teaching in the full-time MBA, the executive MBA, the commerce. I'm also teaching a course in the arts program. So it's ended up becoming a big part of my life. But I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate, because I'm in my 70s. And frankly, unless you own your own business, or you're a partner in a big firm, once you forget your 70s, your 60s, it is very hard to find work in a setting that is meaningful, where you're able to make a positive contribution, where you get excited by the people you're dealing with every day. And so I'm extraordinarily fortunate to be here. I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. That's a cliche, but it's genuinely true. Now, that being said, I've been very fortunate in terms of the student response to my courses as well. And so I do believe that students benefit. I benefit, students benefit as well.
And on that note, I think we should wrap up this episode. I know we've been here for quite a bit now. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate all the advice you've given me, and especially in terms of career and stuff I want to talk about. I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm just gonna do a little quick outro for the thing.
Sure.
So I thank you guys for watching. And if you like this episode with Professor Dan Richards, please like it, save it to your playlist, download on Spotify. And if you want to learn more about Dan Richards, take one of his courses here at the Rotman School of Management, or Rotman Commerce, or the arts course you're teaching for the Arts and Science Department. Check out his LinkedIn. I mean, his LinkedIn is like, if you want an example of something to follow, I definitely modeled mine after yours. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this episode, please like it, share it, and yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching.